University of Waikato. And so Shari does a broad range of research. I would say probably mostly around coastal morphodynamics and the processes that drive coastal morphodynamics. And today she's going to give a interesting talk. I'm quite looking forward to the talk. It's titled "The Science of Returning Freshwater Estuaries and Positioning as a Researcher." And so it's going to be, as I understand, talking about work that she's been doing since returning to New Zealand, and also looking at some of the opportunities of bringing together Western science with Maori knowledge in this coastal science space. All right, thanks a lot, Shari.
Thank you, Ryan. Share my screen with you. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
I assume you can. Okay. Kia ora koutou. Ko te kuhatu whakairi a Ngātoroirangi, ko whangatawatia nā maunga, ko waiho, ko waiora nā awa, ko tika pamuana, ko karirikura nā moana, ko tainui, ko tinana nā waka, ko Ngāti Maru, ko te rarawa nā iwi, ko mātai whitu, ko Roma nā marae, ko Shari aho. Kia ora. So I just shared with you my pepeha, which links me to my tupuna or to my ancestors. It's a way to create whakawhanaunga, so make connections to you. And it also recites my whakapapa. So whakapapa means your genealogy or connections. And it recites them to some of the natural landmarks of my iwi on my mother's and my father's side in Aotearoa. So I introduced to you my maunga, my mountains, my awa, my rivers, and my moana, or my part of the ocean. So I'll come back to some of this later, but for the first part of this talk, I'm going to do a bit about the science of returning freshwater to estuaries. And then after that, I'll talk a little bit about my positioning as a researcher. So hopefully everybody on this Zoom today, if I asked you this question, is this coastal wetland valuable? I'm pretty sure that you would all say yes. But as we all know, often in the past and even today, places like this have not been valued as they should have been, and hence haven't been looked after as they should have been. So in many places, they've been drained, been subject to kind of poor management and catchment practices, and kind of just fallen off the radar a little bit. So this is a very Aotearoa New Zealand framed context, but I think all these things fit elsewhere as well. So just a little quick reflection on why estuaries and their wetlands are important. They're extremely culturally important. I think this is Auckland. You can see this this carving here showing the cultural significance of this place. They're real biodiversity hotspots. They are blue carbon sinks and mangroves, salt marsh, and their sediments. They are important places for kaimoana and other, so seafood and other types of resources as well. And this little cartoon here at the bottom, it just shows some people out there doing some recreations and sporting activities. And down in the corner, you can see Miss Kuia, or this nanny with her two grandkids. So estuaries are also a place for connection, for sharing knowledge, and for sharing stories and passing it down through the generations. And finally, I've got the water jug there just to remind us that estuaries and their wetlands are also referred to as nature's water filters or nature's kidneys as well. So as we know, there's this whole working with nature buzz going on. So there's all these projects happening all around the world now. And a lot of these are aimed at trying to restore something into a better health than it was before. So if we think about estuaries and their wetlands, thanks Mo, my student, for making this diagram. But some of the ways that this is being done, there's managed realignment, which I'll talk about in a minute, letting the sea back in, adding fresh water back. It could be restoring seagrass, salt marsh. It could be creating lagoons, could be a combination, or it could also be removing tidal flats such as by dredging. So where I really first got interested in this space was a few years ago when I was at the University of Southampton, and one of my PhD students, Clementine Sherroll, her PhD was looking at managed realignment. So this little cartoon here, this just is a summary of what that looks like. So this has happened, land draining all throughout the UK, throughout Europe, New Zealand, Australia. It's happened all over the world, where basically coastal wetlands like these, the sea is kind of cut off and they're drained and they're converted to other things, typically pasture or grazing land. So managed realignment basically just means trying to go some way to fix the issues of blocking out the sea. And in this case, you can see here's a levee, and they've literally just bulldozed a hole through the levee, maybe done a bit of dredging to let the sea back in. And here's an example here, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. And here's just a summary of what you might expect to happen. So if you look at panel A, you might start off with something like this in its raw state, sort of tiny little tidal creek system. And then with time, you'll expect it to start to infill with sediment. You'd see headwind erosion of the creek system, start to see the development of salt marsh. This would continue until eventually you have some new system that's in some kind of new dynamic equilibrium. So this is one of the key sites that Clementine looked at, and this is in Sturt, so just next to the Bristol Channel. So this image is from 2010, and you can see it's just lots of farmland. And this is 10 years later in 2020, and you can clearly see this creek system in here. It's very, very muddy in there. You can see these kind of little pools, and you can also see the levee. If you follow around the outside, that's the levee separating that system from the surrounding farmland. So this one case here, it created heaps and heaps of habitat. So a whole lot of salt marsh, intertidal mudflats, brackish, grazing marsh, freshwater lagoons. So actually quite a lot of diversity in that one system. And there are a lot of these systems in the UK and also in Europe. So here's just another view of that system. So there's the Bristol Channel, and this is the River Parrett here on the right. And this system here, this is not a natural creek system. This one was excavated, so it was designed by a consultant or consultants, and then it was dug out and excavated, which took a long time and also cost a lot of money as well. And there's me standing there just to prove to you that I was actually there. But there's a lot of questions about these kinds of systems. You know, how do you design it? How do you figure out what the creek should look like? Do we bother excavating, or can we just leave it and it'll do its thing anyway? So this particular system here, I was speaking to one of the people who was involved in the design process, and sometimes they might try to follow the kind of natural contours of an original creek system if it's there. But in this case, I think it was more of a artistic process, and there was a lot of considerations around things like bird watching, pathways for cycling, where the sheep would graze, and lots of other things as well. So I'm just going to show you a very short video, if it works. Not sure if you can see this very well, but this is just after it had first been breached. So they just taken down that levee. You can see it's very raw looking. It's got really steep sides. It's really muddy. It's definitely not in a state of dynamic equilibrium here. And that's looking out to the River Parrett. Oh, there's Ivan Haig, if you know Ivan. I didn't ask his permission, so hopefully he's happy that I put him on here today. So one of the things that Clementine was looking at is the evolution of these systems to a morphological equilibrium. So obviously we expect a lot of change, and then eventually we assume it's going to kind of calm down and reach its kind of new happy place. So she looked at a lot of these systems like this, about 10 around the UK, and she used LiDAR to create these semi-automated methods to extract things about the creeks, like their surface to volume ratios, lengths, orders, cross-sectional area, all these things. And she looked at all of these, and what she found was that a recreated system like this, to evolve towards its new morphological equilibrium, it probably takes somewhere on the order of around 100 or so years. So actually quite a long time before it kind of settles into its new state. She also found that sites that are higher elevation and that have a smaller inlet, so like a smaller breach, they are the sites that would likely benefit from more creek excavation like this as well. So that's when I really first started getting interested in this kind of restoration of estuaries and wetlands. And since moving back to Aotearoa about just over 2 years ago now, I've been looking at freshwater. So that example was letting the sea back in, and now I'm talking about letting freshwater back in. So if we think of estuaries, we know that an estuary, it needs to have a freshwater source to be an estuary, right? Or else it's not an estuary. But if we go a little bit deeper and we think about what is it about that freshwater that influences the fundamental ecosystem? It's the quality of the water, it's the quantity of the freshwater.
Did you want me to withdraw that from the do money or the grant money?
Someone needs to mute, I think. That's all right. The timing and the seasonality of the freshwater is important. Okay. So this affects things like floodplain inundation.
Finalize how much we have in the other account so we can wipe it out?
Yeah, tomorrow.
I'm not sure we're meant to be hearing it.
Fully accounting tomorrow first.
All right, I'll wait to put that in until tomorrow then.
Okay.
All right, thanks. Sorry.
Someone needs to mute their microphone.
Yeah. Everybody mute their microphone, please.
Okay. So if we think about freshwater and the timing and seasonality, that's important for floodplain inundation, the sediment loading of the freshwater and into the estuary, the transport, dilution and flushing of materials. So it could be pollutants, it could be larvae, it could be sediment, and also the estuary hydrodynamics. And most estuaries around the world are affected by some sort of upstream freshwater manipulation. So it could be dams like this one here. It could be large-scale water extraction for irrigation or for domestic use. It could be large-scale land changes, which change the runoff patterns and timing and seasonality of water and sediment. It can also be diversion of freshwater as well. So just a few notable examples from around the world to get us thinking about it. The Mississippi Delta obviously has a lot of issues with land subsidence, and so this is one example of the Davis Pond freshwater rediversion, where they're rediverting some freshwater back to try and help restore the wetlands and the estuary. This is the Inflows River in St. Lucia in South Africa. So in this, it could be removing the freshwater, and then it's kind of okay for a while. There's a period of resistance, and then eventually it will kind of tip into a new, more degraded state. If we want to recover that system, we may try and reduce the pressure. So it could be putting the freshwater back. And the idea is the system can potentially recover. It might not get back to its original state. So there could be some kind of hysteresis, meaning it won't get back to the original state that it was. That's type 2. And there can also be another type of hysteresis, and that the recovery pathway doesn't follow the same as the degradation pathway, so it can be different. So when we're thinking about the kind of physics of estuaries, their morphology, their hydrodynamics, there's actually not that much done looking at these types of theories of what kind of healthier state could you get your estuary to or your wetland to. What kind of expectations can you have, and how are you going to get there, and how long is it going to take to get there? So one of the places I've been working a lot since moving back here is Te Awa or Ngātoroirangi, the Maketū Estuary. So Te Awa means the water or the river of, and Ngātoroirangi is a famous tuhanga, a priest, and also the navigator of the Te Arawa Waka. So Maketū is very significant. It was a landing site of a Te Arawa Waka when it came from Hawaii in Polynesia. It's been known as Te Pātaka or Te Arawa. That means the food bowl of Te Arawa. It's quite small. It's only 2.3 kilometers squared. It's quite shallow. It's very sandy over here, as you can see, and it gets kind of muddy a bit further up. So the Maketū Estuary, you can see Maketū down here by this yellow dot. The main freshwater source is the Kaituna River. So you can see the Kaituna flows down from Rotorua down here, down to the Maketū Estuary. And I think it's important to remember that not just physically and ecologically the importance of the estuary, but this river also connects the Maketū Estuary. So this quote says, "The Kaituna River is the umbilical cord that joins the tribes of the river. From its commencement at Lake Rotoiti to the Kaituna River tribes are joined together through whakapapa or genealogy. So there's been a long history of engineering works in this estuary. So the Kaituna River used to come straight down here. This is the Kaituna here in this old photo. Used to come down here and go straight into the estuary. But this inlet was very unstable, wasn't very navigable. There were also flooding problems with farmland around here. So in 1956, they blocked it off. So you can see here they've trained the river, so it stays going out this inlet. And there was a lot of water quality issues and sedimentation problems after that. The estuary switched its state, so it used to be a tidal river mouth, and now it became more of a tidal lagoon. In 1996, they recognised the problem of taking this fresh water away. They put a trickle of flow back, about 4% of the fresh water flow, and there was also massive draining of the wetlands around here, also to reduce flooding, basically to allow space for farming. So lots of big impacts. Basically, all of these impacts were of concern and predicted by the local iwi and hapu, the Māori people of the land there. So there was increased sedimentation, loss of ecology, increased salinity, less flushing, more sediment build-up. Some areas of shoreline actually eroded. There was massive loss of wetlands, including harakeke or flax, which is a taonga, a treasured species, particularly for weaving. There was a big shift in the biota and the decline in the kaimoana, or the seafood, and also an increase in sea lettuce and algae problems. So one of the key things that is also of concern is the tidal channels. So I think of tidal channels as the kind of life force, or like the veins of the estuary, right? So here's the main ocean inlet now. You can see this tidal channel coming across here. In the middle, you can see it's very shallow. The channel kind of picks up here and goes down through here. And there's also this smaller lagoon over here. So the connectivity of these tidal channels is a major concern. The iwi said there used to be 3 big tidal channels coming through here. There used to be a small port in here that could get quite large ships in, and now it's quite disconnected and very shallow across the estuary. Now just note this really narrow bit on the spit just here. So that part here has also been a big concern. So this newspaper article was from a few years back, but at this time they were getting quite worried about the spit breaching. They were really worried about a big storm, and they thought that would disrupt the channels, disrupt navigation through the inlet. And this bit here is also a key place for habitat for threatened shorebirds. There's been huge efforts of restoration, restoring the vegetation, removing pine trees and things like that. So in addition to all the kind of physical things, perhaps more importantly is the diversion has also affected the loss of traditional knowledge being handed down. So this includes things like making hinaki or traps, spears, and educating the younger generation on the Māori fishing calendar or maramataka and traditional fishing practices. So it's had a widespread and long impact on the community. Now, one of the interesting things about this project is that one of the key drivers, and this is what it says, in all the official documentation, is to restore the mauri of the river and the estuary and enable the tangata whenua to gather kaimoana again. So mauri means it's like a life force. You could think of it maybe as Chinese qi, if you're familiar with that. So it's not something you can necessarily measure, although there have been various attempts to measure mauri. For example, this simple mauri model by Kepa Morgan, where you can be neutral, or you can be maintaining or enhanced, or you could be diminishing or destroyed. So it's a bit of a scale. And I just think that's an interesting way to look at it, because I think it's quite a unique way to look at restoration. So over the past year or so, there's been 20% of the Kaituna River has been rediverted back into the estuary through a large-scale engineering project. So here is we're looking from the Kaituna River down into the estuary. You can see this channel, this is called the cut, so obviously that's been excavated. You can see the river comes down here, it splits off, some of it goes out here, most of it out at Tutumu, and some of it comes through here, and around 20%-ish on average goes through these culverts. So these are the 12 gates in the building phase. Now we're looking upstream. So there's 12 of them. They're about 1.2 meters across each one. And this is just a temporary road that was later removed. I'm only going to show you one proper graph today. My student, Mojgan Razagi, she's doing her PhD on this. This is just some very initial results. This is some aqueduct data from quite close to these gates further down in the upper estuary. So this is 1 week in February of 2020. So where it says gate commission, that green arrow, they opened 9 of the 12 gates then, and they opened the other remaining 3 the year after. So if you focus on the black line, that's the currents near the bottom. You can see it goes up and down every day with the tide. And you can see when they opened the gates, they commissioned them, you can see the maximum currents increased by about 40%. So just anecdotally, it does look like in the upper estuary that the water is clearer. Just from being in the water, putting instruments in and out, feels less muddy. And there's kind of a compacted mud layer in the upper estuary, which I haven't quite figured out yet. But it'll be really interesting to see, is this enough to kind of flush out the estuary, do anything to reconnect any tidal channels, reduce some of the sedimentation problems, because there is absolute huge expectation on this project. So just moving forward, now I'm thinking about climate change. So we all know that estuaries are this real kind of melting point. We've got land, river, sea, we've got all these pressures coming together. And in my work that I'm working on the next few years, I want to start thinking about climate change and how do we plan for these restorations to account for climate change, especially when we're under so much uncertainty. So for me, this diagram here, don't read the details, but it's just a good one for thinking about the wide-ranging impacts of climate change and the uncertainty for all of those things. So a particular one that I want to look at is the salt and freshwater balance. So for this estuary, that was one of the key drivers as well, was to just make the water fresher again, increase the flushing as well. But what happens with climate change, how will that affect the system? Obviously the sand split and things on the ocean side could change as well. So just for the last part of this talk, I'll try not to be too slow since we've lost a bit of time. I wanted to talk a little bit about what it's been like for me moving back to New Zealand, because many of you would know me very much as a Western trained scientist. I spent 10 years or so in Australia and the UK during my PhD in working. So that's been the bulk of my professional experience so far. But my position, like everyone's, is subjective. I'm a Western trained scientist and researcher. I have European ancestry, and I also have Māori ancestry or whakapapa, and I'm also a iwi or a tribal member as well. I think it's no secret that coastal science, where we're all working, is a field where, no matter where you are, Indigenous peoples' knowledge, values, approaches, and viewpoints are relatively poorly represented. So there's this really awesome book. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. This quote I wanted to share with you today, which says, "The globalization of Western culture and knowledge has worked to reaffirm the West's view of itself as the center of legitimate knowledge." And I think that's quite a powerful quote, just to remember, how the paradigms of how things work has shaped the way we are trained and the way which we view the world and the way which we view science. But as we know, it's becoming more recognized the need to incorporate multiple knowledge systems, including Indigenous knowledge. So for those of you in Australia who may not know this so well, in Aotearoa New Zealand, mātauranga Māori is our Indigenous knowledge system. It's weaved through stories, embedded in our environments, it's in ways of doing, and it's very intergenerational. So it wasn't just created in the past and that's it. It actually develops further with time as it's passed down as well. So we have this VM, as we call it, Vision Mātauranga Policy, which is by our major funding body, which is MB since 2011. And the main aim of this is to help unlock the potential of Māori knowledge, to recognise Māori as partners and to build capacity. So this hasn't been without its controversy, but I think it's been a very powerful way to create change. So it's been quite challenging coming back here and trying to find my place in science back in New Zealand. So this quote, I've got lots of quotes today, sorry, but better than too many graphs maybe. It says, when you're first in an area, you often don't have a person to guide you, especially in the area of science. People can tell you how to do science, but they can't tell you how to be Māori in science. So this has not been an easy journey so far, but a very exciting one. But one of the really key things that I've learnt is that the outcome doesn't trump how the research is done. So we're kind of trained to be very output focused, very focused on the end point, whether it's delivering something, answering our question, getting a Nature paper, delivering on a grant. It could be any of those things. And it's very easy to get so focused on that, I think. And for me, I've sort of had to learning how to take a step back and thinking about how am I doing the research, which is just as important, if not more important, than the actual result. So this is a waka haurua. So this is a traditional double-hulled waka. They told me this was the Mercedes-Benz of waka because it's all fiberglass and it's all beautiful. This one's called Te Maui, and I got to go on this a couple of months ago, I think, in Napier. And this was part of a series of wānanga, or kind of conferences, to really bring together cross-cultural knowledge in the marine space. So this was involving not just academics, but also industry, councils, waka practitioners, non-instrument navigators, iwi and hapu members, and it was just a really awesome event, and I hope to see more of these in the future. This is me trying to put myself in these spaces. This is my one marae of Te Awa, which is my mum's iwi. There's me there, there's my husband, so I got to go there in January. And this is this amazing series of, they call them wānanga, so like a kind of a conference. They have them once a year, and these are for youth of Te Awa. So they come from all over New Zealand, and it's all about science and the environment. So they stay here for 3 nights, and they get out. We go to the forest, the beaches, the rivers, the mountains, and it was just really awesome to see how much these, I think they were 14 to 17-year-olds maybe, how much they changed and grew from this experience. And there's me there trying to run an activity about sand with my kids. Were getting in there, which was cool and annoying at the same time. And we got to do some other things too. I wasn't sure, there wasn't many kids there. It was just my kids and someone else, but they kind of got in there and snuck in front of everyone and everything. So here they are. This is a tuna or an eel. They were helping measure it. I don't think they were squeezing as hard as it looks in this picture. So this is how I'm trying to learn how to do my science. This is a waka taurua. So this one shows a traditional waka here in the red. So this is the kind of waka Māori. It's got Māori worldviews, knowledge and values. And the other one is a wakatoi iwi, so the kind of non-Māori waka with worldviews, knowledge and values. Now this is a paper by Kimberly Maxwell, who's out Waikato as well. So both of these waka, they can go on their own. They can go off and do their own thing, no worries. In this case, they're both traveling in the same direction, but they've temporarily come together, joined by this deck, and they've come to achieve a common purpose. So you can see in this case the whāinga, or the common purpose, the net here. So they've joined together for, in this case, as a joint management approach. But I'm trying to learn to do this way more in science as well. Western science can be good on its own. Indigenous knowledge can be good on its own, but there are times when it's appropriate to come together to achieve something maybe bigger and better and more holistically than we otherwise would. So how does this look in practice? I'm very much still learning how to do this, but this is in Maketū. You can see the gates here behind me. This is the Rewi boy Corbett, who is Ngāti Whakaureki Maketū, and he's also now kairangahau or researcher at Waikato. He's also my friend now, and here we are doing some work together in the Kaituna River. So he is born and bred in Maketū, and his family have been there for many generations. So we've been working together for a year or two now, and I'm really excited where that's going to go. These are a couple of our students a couple of years ago now, before COVID, and they were out there measuring the CTD, some stuff in the estuary. And we had a whole lot of students doing heaps of different projects, and then they all came together at the end and they presented their research back to the community at the local marae. And then this is, I think, November last year. So this is Te Kura, the School of Maketū. So I hosted a day for them, organised it in our labs, and they were looking at the science of harakeke or flax. So they'd already looked at the mātauranga Māori back in Maketū. So they learned waiata, the songs, the ways of doing, and then in the lab they looked at them under the microscope and things like that. And they were so smart, let me tell you. So that's just part of my journey, learning how to do research. It's not in this space, it's not just about the output. So before I finish, I'll show you some family photos. So I'd just like to thank my whānau, and also these are some of my tupuna or my ancestors, some who I've met, some I haven't. But part of my journey coming back here, I had never seen many of these photos before the last few months or even the last year or two. But it's been a journey for me figuring out what is my lens I'm looking in as a scientist, and you know, where am I coming from and how am I positioned. So my final slide, I just have a quote for you, which is Manaki whenua, manaki tangata, haere whakamua, which means care for the land, care for the people, and go forward. Kia ora.